This is the Innovation Forum.
Welcome to the Innovation Forum. I'm Janine Perrott. Tonight, smart cities and the future of our living spaces. From getting around to getting rid of rubbish, we shine a light on where innovation is taking us. Plus, the cost of building our future. Who will pay for the infrastructure we need to make tomorrow's world happen today? And what do the future architects of our smart cities think?
I think Australia has had a bad habit of holding on to old ways of thinking and not really wanting to progress fast enough.
So plenty to talk about. Let me introduce you to our fantastic panel we've got tonight. Joining me this week is the New South Wales Government's Chief Data Scientist and CEO of the New South Wales Data Analytics Centre, Dr Ian Opperman. A futurist specialising in future cities, Shara Evans. Economist for the Centre of Future Work at the Australia Institute, Troy Henderson. And journalist James Riley from innovationoz.com. Welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. But before we get started, what exactly are smart cities and just what makes them so clever? Here's what we know so far. When it comes to reimagining the future, the lines between science and science fiction look more blurred than ever. From drone deliveries to vertical food farms, smart cities are transforming the way people live. And they have to. More than half of the world's population live in cities, and that number is accelerating at enormous speed. Here in Australia, 75% of us live in cities and regional centres, and the growth of our biggest cities is almost unmanageable.
Melbourne and Sydney really are the Tokyos and the Londons of the future. And we need to start thinking that way.
Urban planning has never been more important.
The problems we have today will have tomorrow. We'll always be resource constrained.
Nowhere understands this challenge more than Singapore. The island city-state is one of the most densely populated cities in the world. Bigger than Sydney or Melbourne, its land constraints and lack of resources present even bigger challenges. Singapore has been forced to think 40 to 50 years ahead, committing billions of dollars to coming up with new ways to provide for even the most basic needs, such as food and water. With no space to think outside the box, these farmers have to think inside enormous concrete boxes instead, creating vertical food farms.
We control the air temperature, the humidity, the light durations, the light wavelength. We control the dissolved oxygen in the water as well as the carbon dioxide saturation in the air.
Right now, Singapore also imports more than half of its fresh water supply. Again, new technology is helping to desalinate the salt waters surrounding the island nation. And Singapore is not alone in committing big budgets to big problems. Barcelona is using motion sensors to offer its people real-time information on parking availability and introducing smart street lamps. It's even taking a smart approach to waste management, dealing with it below ground. Elsewhere, security is being stepped up with the rollout of controversial face recognition technology. All over the world, security, efficiency and sustainability is being ramped up to make cities safer and more livable. In 2011-12, New York, London, Chicago, Dublin, San Francisco and Singapore all began the development of long-range master plans. So where is Australia in terms of planning for the future? Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull committed $50 million to accelerate smart city plans.
They are vitally important to our strong economy, and we have some of the best cities, the most livable cities in the world. $1 well spent on planning can save you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in poor investment if you don't know what you're seeking to achieve at the outset. Planning is absolutely critical.
But that money has been spent, and now it's up to state governments to move their cities forward. It doesn't quite look like Singapore just yet, but believe it or not, this cow paddock in Sydney's west is being developed as a technology city. Maybe it's a start, but many argue more needs to be done to future-proof the livability of our cities. Yeah, so let's get straight into it. Why this is important and what are we doing about it? Let's start with you, Ian. What is Australia actively doing to develop small cities, or smart places, I think you like to call them, so we don't leave out regional Australia, which is very important. Are we doing enough? What are we doing?
So it's a great question. There are some really strong imperatives. I mean, the video showed a few of the mega trends around the world around population. It didn't actually talk about some other big issues like not only increasing population, but an ageing population, increasing urbanisation, and of course increasing demand for personalisation of services. And we know, when we start to look out further, we're dealing with changing climate. Australia is awake to the fact that it's really important to address these mega trends. And there's a couple of forces coming together right now. So New South Wales has recently committed to an infrastructure spend over the next 4 years of $80 billion. The Commonwealth Government is committed to $200 billion of infrastructure spend. And there's a really substantial effort to make sure that spend is smart. Now, the question is then, what is smart? And the best way to think about smart investment in smart cities is actually think about what you want to achieve. We talked about livability and sustainability. But with a growing ageing population, we really are talking about sustainable intensification, dealing with more and more people living in more and more urban environments and being able to still produce enough natural resources and food to feed people. So the thinking is starting to genuinely move towards outcomes and thinking about livability, sustainability, adequacy, fairness, transparency. And when we start to think about those outcomes, the work is starting to go into place to think about what do we mean by those things? What do we mean by a 30-minute city? What do we mean by affordability? Building the data sets to not only measure and understand those aspects, but also building the digital equivalent of modern cities, the digital twin of modern cities, so we can start to explore the major points of friction, the real issues that we have to address, and also the what-ifs, so we can plan for those future places.
You talked about some of the big plans, some of the things that are being done, but many people actually think Australia is falling behind. Troy, I know you have concerns about the lack of long-term planning, things like infrastructure. So despite these billions being spent, are we falling behind?
Well, in some ways we probably are, and in some ways we're not. We have to differentiate when we're looking at different issues. So I'd argue particularly on the issue, and you mentioned fairness as a critical aspect of smart cities, that it's not just about having high-tech, fancy solutions, you know, having bullet trains everywhere, which we'd all love to go on, but it is about the kind of societies that we create, the kind of cities we create that people want to live in. And I think particularly the case with housing, we need to start looking at housing as something that people primarily live in, rather than as a speculative asset class. Housing is not like Bitcoin, and that's the road we've travelled down in Australia with our tax treatment of housing, which is, you know, very preferential to people who already own a bunch of properties. And we need to look at the affordability of housing for not just people on Newstart, for example. And there was a report out recently saying that out of 500,000 rental properties, only 2 were affordable for people on Newstart. But for people on just average or middle incomes or low to middle incomes, can emergency service workers who need to be able to live near where they work actually afford to do so? And at the moment, in Sydney and Melbourne, the answer is no.
Because when we talk about smart cities and we see those pictures, you think of something very futuristic. You're talking about practical issues today we have to think about that everybody knows they're going to confront. Shara, I know you agree with Tony, Troy, you've mentioned this lack of foresight, particularly on infrastructure, and you look around the world. How do you think Australia compares at the moment?
Well, good and bad. There's some really amazing projects that I've come across, but let me talk about some of the deficits. If I look around the world at car manufacturers, all of them are producing electric vehicles or hybrid electric vehicles. And in Sydney, I think there's less than a handful of EV charging stations. That is absolutely a lack of foresight. In other parts of the world, every city has hundreds of EV stations.
You do know there's
already.
a bit of a plan to improve that in the election campaign on one side. That we won't get into the politics of it, but it's a point.
But it's a really important thing because these are the cars that are going to be the model car years for next year and the year after. This isn't somewhere way out in the future. This is in the here and now. We've got to start thinking about driverless vehicles and how they're going to interface with our existing road systems and things like vehicle-to-vehicle networks and putting sensors on infrastructure so that speed limit signs are broadcasting, hey, it's a 60-kilometer zone.
Because California's already doing that.
Yeah, it's all doable today. And when you have autonomous vehicles, you literally have the ability to avoid all kinds of accidents by having the infrastructure talking to the cars and cars talking to each other. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. When it comes to affordability of housing, one of the ways to make housing more affordable is to make it really fast to be able to get from a regional area into the CBD. And that's where futuristic technologies like hyperloops come in. And for those of you who haven't heard of it, it's basically taking a tube, sucking the air out of it so you don't get air friction, and hurtling pods of people or cargo through at an average cruising speed of 700 to 800
See,
kilometers
now that really
per
is
hour.
sounding like Blade Runner and Jetsons.
Oh, it
and
is.
it was Elon Musk that came up with that, I think,
was.
wasn't it? Yeah.
But can you imagine getting from Newcastle to Sydney in 10 minutes?
Phew.
That means...
No.
Well, with a Hyperloop, and there are test tracks being built all around the world right now. So this isn't just science fiction stuff. This is stuff that's being built. If we were to have a Hyperloop going, let's say, across the East Coast and being able to get from regional areas to CBD areas in a matter of minutes, then this whole concept of 30-minute cities takes on a whole new meaning.
Well, that's an interesting point. James, I'm using your journalistic cynicism here to try and make sense of this because it sounds great in theory. There's no reason, obviously, technically, we can't think about it. We all know the politics of it. Yep. Forget affordable housing, electric cars. One of the policies I know in Geelong is for a faster train, not even a very fast train, not even fast, just faster than the slow train. How realistic is it that we can, if there is a deficit between us and some of the countries we talked about, how realistic is it that we can get there?
Look, to talk about hyperloops, we know that there are some hyperloop startups in Australia who are doing some interesting stuff. Virgin's Hyperloop company is here lobbying government. But realistically, we are in an election campaign. People want to see what we can, what can be achieved in the short term. When we talk about hyperloops, also I can't help thinking about fast trains and we've had so many studies about.
But you know what? Hyperloops are so much faster than fast trains, and I've seen some studies, and mind you, I haven't gone through all the details. But one study I saw suggests that a fast train might cost $200 billion, whereas a hyperloop might be $50 billion.
Yep.
We are going to get to the funding of this in the second part, so I don't want to go too far down the funding. We're talking in the general sense because obviously someone has to pay for it. But James, just on that.
Yeah, look, I think to the original point you were making about foresighting, I think that's incredibly important. Everything to do with smart cities, everything to do with building livable cities is based on data. And I don't think when we talk about is Australia falling behind, I think we need to be mindful of are we building the kind of data infrastructure that will allow us to have the foresighting to make smart infrastructure investments. I think just very quickly, again, I guess going to the election, when we talk about cities, we tend to be talking about physical infrastructure and things we can cut ribbons on, and we're not talking about the data that underpins the decision making on that stuff. And that's incredibly important. And to your point, I think we were talking earlier, there's a real issue among our parliamentarians that they're not particularly interested in the data side. It's not that, it's not that they don't know that it's important. They know it's important, but they're not particularly interested, and they certainly don't engage at that level.
Probably because they don't understand as well as Ian. That's why we're going to get to it in the next segment. But just before we get to that, Ian, I mentioned at the start you prefer to call them smart places. And I think it's an important point, even though we know that we're all concentrated on the east coast of Australia and we all live in cities. There is regional Australia, and they're very important, and they vote too.
Absolutely.
Smart places. I mean, Shara talked about having hyperloops, whatever it is, that brings people within 30 minutes of the city. But we're a big country. Not everyone's going to be in a smart city. How do we not leave them behind? How do we get smart places?
Absolutely. So I think the point about smart places is absolutely right. So whilst without regional Australia, we really can't feed ourselves. We can't do all of the things that actually makes us a vibrant economy and a great country to live in. So every regional centre has the right to be as smart as every urban environment. And there is quite a lot of effort being put into that space. I spent this afternoon talking about what Wagga is doing with their smart precincts and the the thinking behind these outcomes, thinking about livability, affordability, that just as applicable in regional Australia as it is in urban Australia. It's also, this issue of sustainability is a really interesting one. We project forward 2030. Most people are pretty comfortable thinking about 2030 because it's 10 years from now and you can think about what's going to change in population and so on. 2030 is the beginning of a really big change to 2040, 2050. And if you think about sustainability a generation from now, there's a really substantial amount of effort that needs to go into thinking about infrastructure, the digital equivalent, so we can do the what-ifs, so we can identify risks, and we can do essentially the digital twin of most environments. So we should definitely be thinking about regional Australia, and there is no reason why that thinking can't be just as sophisticated as we're thinking about Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne.
Cheryl, we talk about, you talked about the 30 minutes and we're talking about regional Australia. I notice, I think it's India, has smart villages. There's no reason we can't have smart, we don't call them villages, but smart centres.
Smart regional communities. And it's all about putting sensors and the right infrastructure in to be able to capture data and also secure that data so that it's not abused, and using things like artificial intelligence, predictive analytics to help us understand that data, mash lots of different data sets together, compare those data sets with other similar situations around the world, and then that helps us to come up with plans that will give us the environment that we want to live in the future.
Could I add to that I've got a bunch of family in regional New South Wales. We've probably all got family in different country towns, and mine are in Armidale in northern New South Wales. And you cannot imagine Armidale without the University of New England. It is a key part to making that regional economy work. And we can say the same thing about Wagga and Bathurst, and there is no reason why we can't have more industries that function as an anchor for regional economies around the state and around the nation.
James, as again, from a, call it a marketing or an image perspective, the term smart cities, you don't want it to become like innovation where you have to explain it, it's a buzzword. Smart places is one thing, but smart cities, do you think that does leave people home? We've got to make it broader, we've got to argue it, explain it as we're doing here tonight, what it actually means? Because it's a very broad term. It's not just I've got great free Wi-Fi in San Fran.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the definition surely must include regional Australia, as we've just been saying. I sort of like the term, you've got your term, mine would be intelligent communities. I think within large metropolises, we're not all Singapore, we're not all London or Berlin, but within those large metropolises, there's things like the Innovation and Technology Precinct that the New South Wales government's talking about, and that within, it's sort of communities within communities within communities. So to me, it's about connectivity between communities. So of course there can be things going on in Wagga that can be directly linked into things going on in other cities around Australia. I think to me it's about the data, the connectivity.
And also, it's not just regional centres, it's the rural areas too. And technology like sensors and robots is absolutely essential for our farming community and for agriculture. And that's a really big industry in Australia, and one where we're set to literally take advantage of these technologies to expand the yield that we produce. I think something like robots as a service, where you've got robots that are used all in all kinds of agricultural functions, and not have every farmer own the robot, but actually have other companies own it and let them use it as a service.
Not to mention, we've got time for one more question, just quickly on that. And I'm thinking smart villages in India, smart towns, we call them country towns. I started by saying about us being left behind, where we're being left behind. You mentioned, Ian, where we're doing well, those big infrastructure spends. I'm just going to ask quickly, just a very quick one to each of you, where Australia is actually doing very well on it. Would you say it wasn't that spend on infrastructure?
So it's a really good start, but Australia is really starting to wake up to the fact that the world is moving fast, believe it or not, in standards. So Australia is stepping up and participating very strongly in the smart city standards.
James, where do you think we might, if not ahead, at least we're really keeping up? Our best. What's our best on smart cities, do you reckon? Or is it that hard to find one?
Look, Australians are fast followers, I would say. I don't know that we punch above our weight as we like to claim a lot. To be honest, I know we're going to get into the data session a little bit later. I think we're doing some very interesting things in New South Wales around the organisation of government and the use of data.
Shari, as I said, you do a lot overseas. Just quickly, if you have to name something where Australia's ahead or doing really well.
We have some of the best robotics labs in the world, bar none, especially when it comes to agriculture and autonomous robots. We have robots that have been maintaining the Sydney Harbour Bridge for the last 7+ years.
We had a dish that helped with the moon landing, for God's sake. We've been doing this. And this is our competitive advantage, isn't it? It's the brain drain. I spent some time at Stanford. The number of Australians there. So that is something. Surely in education, in brain power, we are innovative and should be helping the world.
We do have a pretty good track record in terms of types of innovation. So in areas like renewable energy, we Australian scientists have developed many of the technologies that are then commercialised by businesses in Germany and China.
Well, we're giving something to the world. There you go. We're going to take a quick break there, but after the break, who's going to pay for the development of our smart cities? And how will we manage data and privacy? That is a crucial area. You'll be fascinated to hear about that, what goes on at an airport. Cheryl's going to tell us what she worries about. Plus, what the future architects of our cities actually think. That's all to come on the Innovation Forum, so don't go away.
This program proudly supported by ACS. Think ahead, create the future, change the world.
Welcome back to the Innovation Forum, where we're discussing the future of our cities. Well, actually the future of the country, really. With me this evening is the VP of ACS and the New South Wales Chief Data Scientist, Ian Opperman, the futurist, Shara Evans, research economist at the Australia Institute, Troy Henderson, and James Riley from InnovationAus.com. Now, we had a good discussion setting the scene for why this is important, smart cities, what we can do, where we're behind, where we're ahead. But it always comes down to money. We're in the middle of an election campaign, ostensibly deciding our future, but we don't hear much about this issue. I mean, we touch on it in different ways, and as we heard at the outset, in 2016, the then Turnbull government brought out a Smart Cities plan, a whole 5 chapters. Haven't heard much since. A lot about congestion. So where do the political parties stand on smart cities and investing in our future? Because, as I said, it's all about money. We touched on it even in that first segment. I know everyone here said, oh, I don't really know the policies. Housing affordability, infrastructure spending, electric cars and charging. All of these things are in the election campaign. But as a grand plan, we talked about the lack of foresight. Should it be front and centre of the election? And do you feel it's just too bitsy? Is there a plan there, do you?
Well, look, I don't know. I guess you wouldn't call it a plan. To be fair to the government, the city deals programs that they're in, the smart cities policy that they had in place that Malcolm Turnbull was announcing in that first role, I think they did make some headway there. I think that there was some momentum built. Townsville, I think, from memory, was the first city deal, and they're a year into it, and they have made some progress. Momentum has definitely kind of fallen out of it, though, and I think it goes back to the definitions we were talking about around, you know, what is a city and the siloed nature of the different parts of government that are addressing cities. Cities are complex beasts. Cities are addressed by all of the all of the kind of
so no sort of
holistic,
cohesive plan.
Look, I think whatever holistic plan had been forming, I think the air is somewhat.
We do have a minister for smart cities, though, now, don't we? Or a minister for cities. Well, that's a breakthrough.
Alan Tudge is the minister for cities. He's also the minister for infrastructure.
There you go.
And as I was saying before, I think the cities kind of gets lost under the weight of physical infrastructure as opposed to what is the core of the issue.
Well, the question, as I keep saying, is who is going to pay for future development? Now, it's usually government, but the private sector presumably can do its bit too. Troy, you're an economist. Do you advise on this? Where is the private sector in it? It's great that everyone says, oh, you know, government will keep them out or they're not doing enough. But at the end of the day, that's where the big bucks come from, isn't it?
Well, I think the big bucks come from both government and the private sector, and that the public sector really needs to take the lead on this sort of long-term infrastructure investment, which we've been talking about as something that's at the core of smart cities. Australia needs to get over its debt phobia, its public debt phobia, the endless, going on and on about deficits. If we have a deficit, if we have a surplus next year, it will be the 20th since Federation, right? So it's not an indicator of incredible economic management. The great Sir Robert Menzies delivered no fiscal surpluses in his time in power. So at a time of historically low global interest rates, it's actually extremely negligent of state and federal governments not to borrow to invest in productive economic, social and environmental infrastructure.
Shara, you think asset management has a role to play in this?
Well, it does, but also, just going back to what can government do, it needs to set the right regulatory framework for investment from the public and private sector. There was a parliamentary report just a few weeks ago where another one of the Hyperloop companies, Hyperloop Transport Technologies, suggested in this report that they would like to do a public-private infrastructure investment, and that they thought that they could put a Hyperloop across a good part of Australia in 4 years. But you need the right settings for something like that to happen. And there are things like flying taxis, drones that carry people and taxi them around. Without the right regulatory setting, we're not going to see that here. Whereas in other parts of the world, I'm seeing public-private partnerships where the companies that are investing in these new technologies are actually doing trials in conjunction with government partners. We need to see that in smart asset investment is all a part of it because it leads to the bigger transport picture. And if you allow companies to invest because they've got the right framework to do so, then they will.
Money isn't the only big concern when we talk about building the future, though. There are also big concerns about how our data is used and how secure it is. Now, Ian, you're the Chief Data Scientist for the New South Wales Government. It's a very impressive title. But this is something that you look at specifically. Tell us about the importance of data, where it fits in, what are your concerns on that area?
So you had me at data. It's something I think about, of course, every single day of my life. And I think to James's point, there's a lot about smart cities which actually is dependent on data. It's not smart. Concrete is not smart. Steel is not smart. What makes it smart is the ability to collect data, analyse, optimise, and then potentially modify traffic lanes or service delivery, or even thinking of infrastructure as a way of delivering services. But all of that requires use of a lot of data. And whether it's a smart light, or whether it's a video, or whether it's even just counting cars going through a system, each one of those bits of data has a little bit of personal information. And currently, the world, and this is why I did mention standards before the break, and I really do mean it, if you could stay awake as I talk about standards. There is always personal information in data, but we assume that it either is or is not personally identifiable data. And it's a very, very different world if you cross the line and say this data is personally identifiable. I can identify James from this data set as opposed to identifying record 001, which has this behaviour. And that difference is something which really drives bimodal or black and white behaviour. We either lock it up and don't do anything with it, or protect it like it's Fort Knox, or we aggregate it to the point where it's actually not that useful. Australia is genuinely leading the way in the ability to understand how much personal information is in data, and as you keep linking data sets together, that test of reasonable likelihood of re-identification is something Australia is genuinely spearheading, tackling. A shout out to the Australian Computer Society and Standards Australia, and a whole lot of different governments and companies who are working together to try and build frameworks. The ability to understand, to model, to identify the risks, and to identify what happens to a person, a child, a family, a household, a car, a building, a property, all comes about because we can link data sets together. Understanding when we've crossed the line and gone into personally identifiable is something that Australia is actually globally leading the charge on. So whilst in my day job we collect, link, process and analyse, the ability to understand how safe that data is from a personal identifiable perspective is something Australia is genuinely leading the world on.
Troy, I know this is something you've also looked at, the importance of privacy, which Ian just touched on, especially in things like health records. Now, we saw that with the My Health. People are Ian's looking at it obviously from the broader perspective of how important this is. It's crucial to smart cities, but Australians looked at, oh, I'm not sure I want my data there.
Well, who
It's too
opted in and
risky.
who opted out of my health? Yeah, exactly. Health is an obvious area where privacy is a key concern. I can understand all of the areas where big data is going to be very useful for planning for smart cities. But it's not just in relation to health. At the Centre for Future Work, we did some research into electronic monitoring and surveillance in the workplace. And we found that 70% of Australian workers had some form of electronic monitoring and surveillance at their place of work. 70% thought that that reduced their level of privacy, and 60% of those workers thought it undermined the level of trust between employers and employees. So there are some legitimate concerns, as well as some very important and exciting uses for big data.
Were we too paranoid about my health?
I don't know, I haven't signed up yet.
You're nodding away there, James.
Well, I just think the My Health thing, the project I thought was poorly sold, like in a pretty big way. The benefits to society broadly, but also to individuals of that project were certainly worth signing up.
I totally disagree. I'm a privacy advocate, and there's no way in the world that I would sign up.
Right, well, I wanted to talk to you because you've got some fascinating examples from ride-sharing in Chicago to sharing your Wi-Fi at airports. Tell us what we don't know or don't think enough about.
Number one, data breaches happen every day, and there are massive ones, and I've been personally caught up in some of them, you know, the big ones with 500 million people or 1 billion people whose records have been caught up. And it is not fun when it happens to you. In Chicago, they do a lot of really interesting things with deploying sensors and tracking all kinds of interesting information about the city. But what they've decided to do is create this database of ride-sharing data and make it open source so that other people can use it. But when I downloaded this database, which is freely available, I was able to literally copy-paste from a spreadsheet the exact geo-coordinates, paste it into Google Maps, and find out somebody's home address and see a picture of it on Google Street View. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of rows of data of what I would consider personally identifiable data that with geospatial tools, I could literally do pattern of life tracking super easily with that one data set.
Ian, I see you nodding on that. You were talking about the advantages of data, but when Shara gives us examples like this, I mean, it's progress versus privacy here, isn't it?
But I think that's exactly the problem. So we actually don't understand how much personal information is in data that we release, whether it's individually or governments being open and releasing data sets. So we carried out an exercise, again, under the banner of the Australian Computer Society in February this year. We took 3 data sets. One was a made-up hospital admission data set, which was a really fun made-up data set. One was New York taxis, and one was ATO data. And we said, tell us how much personal information is in there. We had these teams working together for every Thursday in February, trying to analyse whether or not you could do exactly what Sharon is talking about. And the answer is, you could. So the ability to know, the ability to put some sort of quantification, some measures around it, and to build risk frameworks so that if we release data, we at least should be able to measure how much personal information is there. It's something that does not exist at the moment.
But Ian, this is exactly where you're advising. Are we putting has the stable door gone? Has the horse bolted? Because, I mean, it's all very well to say we should put things in place, but once that information's out there, for example, like Shara talks about, what good is it? We're putting in laws now, but they kind of come after we find the problem. Is it too late?
So it's a really interesting question, and I optimistically would like to say it's not too late, because every single one of us is still alive, every single one of us is generating data every second of every day. And even if right now that we have created a vulnerability because we didn't understand how much personal information, we have future lives, we have children, we have the next generation. So it's not okay to give up, and it's certainly not okay to say that the horse is bolted.
Troy, given your concerns, what do you think of what we're hearing here?
Well, I agree that you don't give up on something just because there are problems with it now. But if we're looking at something just, say, for example, the workplace, we basically want to have a situation where workers, employees have normal workplace rights despite the increased use of these types of digital monitoring and surveillance technologies. you know, no one should be subjected to being fired by an app. You have to go through, you know, the normal processes of the right of review and right of reply in the workplace and in other spheres of our complex, multi-layered lives.
Well, that goes to something that many of you have mentioned about, I would say the humanity, but about smart cities being about people too. They've got to be human. We can't just be obsessed, James, with the technology or the data. When we talk about livable cities, it's about the people.
Yeah, and I guess as an extension of who pays for this stuff, of course it's part public, part private. I think if we're talking about surveillance, then I guess we would have to talk about Google. We are constantly surveilled by companies like Google, but Google is delivering services like Maps.
And everybody ticks the box, and a young generation don't see the problem.
But if we're talking smart cities, if traffic, we can see traffic through Maps. It's quite incredible. It's incredibly powerful. That's not a government service. That's a private sector service that's come in. It's happened because of data collection. That's you know, part of the trade-off. I think, you know, of course, you know, we say privacy is sacrosanct, but we also are rethinking what privacy means in the world we live in now, and where the benefits of data use are. We're also trying to understand trust a little bit more. I find it kind of extraordinary that people don't trust government in their use of data and insist on keeping these strict silos, whereas in the private sector, you certainly wouldn't call it a free-for-all, but you know, data surveillance is far more prolific.
Well, I think in the private sector, a lot of people do not realize just how much data they're actually giving away. You know, they want to use an app and they just don't think about how the information that they're using on that app is going to be used, and it's click wrap.
Well, I'm dying to know what 6G is going to mean for it, and in Ian, we have an expert on that here, and we'll be talking about that after the break, as well as what young people who are actually building, working and living in our future cities think we should be making our priority. That's to come on the Innovation Forum. Welcome back to the Innovation Forum. Tonight we're discussing smart cities. To find out what our cities and living spaces of the future should look like, we thought we'd ask the very people who will be responsible for building and living in them. Here's what the students at the University of Technology, Sydney had to say.
For me, a lot of it has to do with the flow of the city and congestion. And I think Australia has had a bad habit of holding on to old ways of thinking and not really wanting to progress fast enough. And also not taking into consideration environmental factors and long-term approaches in terms of building. And so we're seeing a lot of, fast buildings being built and all that kind of stuff without really thinking, what's in the long run going to be best for the city.
For me personally, as long as it's an effective and adaptable system, whether it be roadwork, infrastructure, buildings, transport, as long as it's effective and it is open to changing, it's not locked into some weird, fixed state where it's not adaptable depending on things like climate and population changes and stuff, then I'm all for it.
Obviously, I would want a city that integrates a lot of the technology that is currently available and will be available. So we want a city that is very flexible. It can be modularized. It can integrate evolving types of technology with time, without obviously endangering the historical artifacts and much of the heritage sites that define the city that we currently live in.
I would hopefully imagine them to be a bit more green and more eco-friendly and sustainable.
I think integration of technology in everyday life is definitely going to increase, especially because people are already testing drones delivering food and stuff like that, and we've got smart systems coming to bus stops and stuff like that. So I think we'll have a larger dependence on technology, but maybe not hovercrafts or anything flying around. Yeah, I think that's still quite far off.
So the voices of the future, they echo many of the points that our panels made tonight, but they've also brought us some that are more of concern to them, perhaps the environment, sustainability. So for our panel, the next question is, where do we go from here? What should we address in order to create a well-funded and ethical world tomorrow. Shara, I'm going to start with you because you are actually, you were described me as one of the world's top female futurists. I'll take the female out, but you are a professional futurist.
Yes.
So what's the future?
Well, sustainability is so important. In fact, I just came back from the Middle East. I was in Oman giving a keynote speech, and one of the areas I needed to talk about was energy and the future of energy. So I did a bit of research on what's happening in the Middle East. And believe it or not, they are spending $1 trillion from 2013 to 2023 on sustainable energy across the Gulf states in the Middle East. And not only that, but a number of countries across the region are actually making renewable energy, solar and wind power and hydrogen power, a huge priority. Now, this is an area of the world that has more oil and gas than almost any other part of the planet, but UAE has a 2050 strategy to have 75% of its energy come from renewable sources by 2050. That's pretty amazing.
There's the future. Ian, you're Chief Data Scientist for New South Wales and CEO of the company Data Analytics Centre. I know you're an expert in 6G. I thought it was in one of those roles, and obviously if we're talking the future, 6G, we can all, well, we're getting ahead around 4G. But you did say to me that you do this for fun, studying 6G.
Absolutely.
Tell us what 6G is, because we can barely handle 4G yet.
So this is 4G. And roughly speaking, every 10 years we've had a G. 5G comes out next year officially, so it's 2020. And so to some extent, it's a little bit like tracking Moore's Law. There's another G kind of planned for 2030. But I think to Shara's point, there is a really interesting set of changes which are driving what we expect the world to look like in 2030. An increasing population. The expectation is there's an extra billion people on the planet by 2030. That grows to an extra 2 billion people by 2050. So 2030 is the beginning of a pretty big inflection point in the future. Population is not only growing, but it's aging, it's urbanising. And like it or not, we've got a climate which is changing. So less arable land, species decline, and where we can grow food and how many calories we need to get per square metre or per acre per hectare is actually going up. So when we think about 6G, the question is, what's the technology response to growing, ageing, urbanising population, changing environment? No more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We've got a challenge of sustainable intensification. So we've been looking at where 5G is projected to go in terms of coverage, capacity, reliability, and latency, and what the difference is, and that's the beginning of the demand for 6G. So we're in Finland recently, and 350 kilometres north of the Arctic Circle, watching the Northern Lights every night, and spending our days talking about the future world, the difference between where tech is taking us, how far silicon can go, how far radio can go with our current understanding. We're reaching the limits of the speed at which silicon can switch, and what the tech needs would be for 6G. And it's a pretty big gap.
Oh, okay then. Troy, happy and healthy cities, people before profit, idealistic people like we heard from there. One of your specialties as the Economist is a particular interest in the future of work. So give us your summary, just a quick summary of where the future is for cities as far as work goes.
Well, there's going to be enormous diversity in terms of work. 90% of the jobs that were created in Australia in the last 5 years were created in our capital cities, mostly in Melbourne and Sydney, and those trends are likely to continue. But young people face particular challenges around work because they're the most likely to be doing casual work or insecure work. And you do want to give them the opportunity to be creative and to come up with some of these wonderful sustainability solutions, technological innovations that we would all like to see. But they then need those maybe in some ways boring things like secure housing or secure work in order to have that bedrock on which to create the society of the future.
James, you're a journalist, you work in the innovation.com space. What do you want to see in the future? What's your future that you say for our smart cities?
Innovationoz.com, we write about public policy as it relates to the tech sector, tech and innovation. So it's deep niche. It's not a mass appeal subject. I guess in the future, if I want to not look too far in the future, I would actually like to see, in terms of cities and creating livable cities, the three levels of government work better together, and work better together, particularly in relation to, I keep saying it, in relation to data. Just in terms of the jobs of the future stuff, it would also, from a national perspective, be great if our leaders could talk about some of the things that are coming down the pipe. It's all great for Ed Husick to be out there as a one-man band talking about impact on jobs, disruption, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all the things we know are going to hit. We know they're going to hit, but we're not talking about it. And we're not talking about it in an election campaign.
We are. So good on us, because, you know, maybe somebody out there is watching tonight who's in the middle of an election campaign telling us the future's important. But this is why we talk about it. And I want to thank you very much. Fabulous panel tonight. Let me go around. Ian, I'm just getting your exact title. You have so many. I'll stick with New South Wales Government's Chief Data Scientist, Dr. Ian Opperman. Thank you for your time. Futurist, world-leading futurist. Shara, thank you very much for your time tonight. I'm getting all your titles right for this. Economist for the Centre of Future Work at the Australia Institute, Troy Henderson, and James Riley from innovationoz.com. And Shara, I should just ask you, do you have a website? I didn't give that out.
SharaEvans.com.
SharaEvans.com. We might as well, for all the effort. Really appreciate it. And thank you very much for all your time tonight. Now, we'll be back because of that election thing we mentioned. There's a lot coming up. We're going to be back actually on May 23, so we look forward to seeing you then, and we'll be talking then about deep tech at Barangaroo. Oh, that's got you interested, isn't it? Put it in your diary. Hope you can join us then. Good night for now. And, of course, coming up next, the great Paul Murray, all the way from Brisbane. You do not touch your dial there. Bye.